Hi, thank you very much. It's nice to be here. The plan today is I'm going to start off by outlining what seems to be a little bit of a problem that many of us are facing in our classrooms today. I'm going to talk about the topic of engagement, which is sort of the background to this talk and how we came to be interested in this. I'm going to talk a little bit about teacher-student rapport, and I'm going to talk about positive classroom culture. So I'm talking about two relational aspects, and that's going to be the focus of what we're going to have a look at today. I'm sorry I keep bending my head. I've got new varifocals, and I've discovered that the screen is right in the line. So if I'm doing a lot of head bouncing, that's why. Right, so what is the problem? Why am I showing you a goldfish? Anybody know? Shout out. Anyone know why a goldfish? Attention span. So you may have heard that it's slightly an urban myth, and the statistics are not quite right, but it serves my purpose nicely. Apparently, we have lower attention spans than a goldfish. It's not actually true, but our attention spans are shrinking, and we're finding it more and more difficult to concentrate for longer periods of time. And I think you'll be familiar that that's certainly the case also with many of the learners, but also with ourselves. There's a study by Microsoft, ironically, called the Attention Span Study, and they talk about the 4 different types of attention that exist. Sustained attention, selective attention, alternating, and divided. So sustained attention is how able we are to focus on something for an extended period of time and concentrate on it. Selective is how we are able to focus on one thing and block out other things. Alternating attention is how able we are to switch between different types of things that we're focusing our attention on. And divided attention is how we can concentrate on 2 things simultaneously, so the infamous multitasking. Allegedly, we're getting better at it, which is a bit of a worry on all kinds of levels. But the point that I want to make is that attention is limited. Okay, it's not boundless. We don't have endless amounts of attention. It is limited. So we have to make some selection in what we give our attention to. And that's just a normal part of being human. Contemporary classrooms and contemporary life, there's lots of multiple demands at the same time. Things go at an incredible pace. There's all kinds of distractions. Learners are used to instant gratification. If they want to know something, if they want to see something, it's instantaneous. And there's just a sheer volume of information. So when I come to a wonderful conference like this and I hear things, I think, oh, that's really interesting. And then it opens up this whole Pandora box of things I don't know. And there's just sort of endless amounts of information out there. So it becomes ever more demanding in where do we put our attention? How do we manage our attention? And one of the things that has become one of the key things is not how do we motivate learners, but how do we manage their attention? And that's part of the problem. So this has been considered now that attention is now the main focus of a lot of educational research. And this is a great quote. It's the gatekeeper of our working memory. So it's basically you can't learn easily without paying attention to things. Your attention on some level has to be devoted to what you're learning. It's the ultimate currency of our classrooms. Let's have a look at your attention. Okay, there's a little test for you here. Let's see how good your attention is.
To test just how much attention the attention-stealing design of the new Skoda Fabia actually steals, we left one parked on this ordinary road in West London. We wanted to see if its sharp crystalline shapes, bold lines, and lower, wider profile would attract the desired level of attention. Will the 17-inch black alloy wheels stop passers-by in their tracks? Will the angular headlights attract the attention of other road users? Will a crowd gather to check out its fresh, sporty look? Well, not quite. But did the attention-stealing design distract you from noticing that the entire street has been changing right before your very eyes? Don't believe us? Have another look. Did you spot the van changing to a taxi? How about the scooter changing to a pair of bicycles? Or the lady holding a pig? Let alone the fact that the entire street is now completely different. Didn't think so. So there we have it. Proof that the new Skoda Fabia is truly attention-stealing.
I do not work for Skoda, just to clarify. Some of you may be familiar with another version of this called the gorilla experiment. Yeah. Okay, well, it's the same thing, but I thought you probably all know the gorilla experiment, so I need to try something else with you. And this is a wonderful example of what's called inattentional blindness. And this is the fact that when we are focusing on one thing, we become blind to other things. And that's why, for example, when you're driving your car, very often accidents happen because we just go blind to certain things because we're concentrating on what's happening. And that's the danger of our peripheral attention on, for example, pavements, crossings, those kinds of things. So attention is a limited resource. That's the problem. And the demands on learners' attention are increasing dramatically, but also on our own. And I'll come to that a little bit later as well. So our solution, I wish we had the solution, part of our approach to dealing with that problem was to start looking at the notion of engagement. And engagement is a construct that is used widely in psychology and has become hugely popular. And it has started to replace things like motivation for the obvious reason that it's about getting learners engaged and keeping their attention. You can be the most motivated learner in the world, but if something distracts you, you're off. And you might not actually engage with the learning that's in front of you. And so that is one of the reasons why we became particularly interested in engagement as a construct. So the challenges that we saw was that there are sort of 3 levels of challenge. The first level of challenge is we've got to get learners willing to engage. So when they come into our classrooms, when they come to work with us, they've got to be willing to fundamentally engage with what we're working with and what we're presenting them. That's the first stage. That's, if you like, the foundations of engagement. We then have to trigger their active engagement. We've got to get them. We've got to get some kind of hook to get them in. And then we've got to keep them there. And that's not easy either. So there's all sorts of things you can do to grab their attention, but it's another matter to keep their attention and keep them with you. So those are the 3 levels that we looked at in the work that we've been doing on engagement, is how to create that fundamental willingness to engage so that they even want to, and then how to trigger that initial engagement, and how to keep learners engaged and keep them on task. I don't pretend for a moment that it's easy, and I don't pretend that we have all the answers to it, but some of the things we do maybe help us to do this a little bit more effectively. Just to clarify what we understand by engagement, this has been considered lately as the holy grail of learning and one of the hottest topics in the field of educational psychology. It is certainly, in my view, the direction where our field will start to go, and also where some of the research is starting to head, because it's a different time. The problems are different. And the great thing about engagement is it's quite empowering for teachers, because there's a lot you can do. There's a wonderful quote from someone at IATEFL, and my great apologies to whoever it was giving the talk that I don't remember their name. She said, you can take a horse to water, but you can't make it drink, but you can make it thirsty. And I think that's brilliant. And that's what this is about, and that's what engagement can do, almost more so than motivation, is we can make them thirsty for learning. Curiosity, interest, mystery, puzzlement, and so on. But to understand engagement, it's about active participation. That's the key. The word active is fundamental to understanding engagement. It's about the fact that learners are on task doing stuff. And with language learning, even more so than any other subject, it's about using the language, being involved in the language. That's why engagement is so powerful. But it's not just going through the motions. And this is where engagement becomes a little bit more complex. I'm not really going to go into that today. There's not enough time. But it's not compliance. It's not just doing what the teacher said. That's not real engagement. So there's what we call fake engagement, fake news, fake engagement, and real engagement. Real engagement is about deep learning. Keeping people busy is not engagement. Okay, so we have to be a little bit careful. It's not compliance. It's not going through the moment. It's not busyness. That's not what engagement is. Engagement has to be meaningful and has to lead to learning. And there are 3 kind of components, 3 levels, if you like, on which you want to get the learners engaged. Effective, you want to get them emotionally hooked into learning. Cognitive, this is the wonderful talk we've just had. You've got to get them thinking, you've got to get them mentally engaged with what they're doing. And behaviorally, they've got to be doing it. They've got to be actively working on it, doing it, engaged in it. I apologize for the selfless plug. There's a book that I've had the joy of writing together with Zoltan, who's been a wonderful co-author, and there's 2 parts to the book. There's generating the willingness to engage, which is like setting the foundations, if you like, for getting learners to want to engage, because that's a lot of groundwork we need to do. So a lot of the things I've been to today, the talks, have made very clear you can't just go in with an innovation. You've got to set your groundwork in place, and that's what this is about. And then there is how we as designers, teachers as designers, how we design learning experiences to be engaging, and that's the second part. Now, in view of the fact that we have been emphasizing today the notion of togetherness, better learning with cooperation, working together, that is why we decided with CUP that they would like to look at generating the willingness to engage and looking at that relational aspect and what we can do to create the sort of starting place for engagement. I'm not going to dwell on this, but for those of you who are interested, there's a wonderful theoretical framework to fall back on. And for those of you who have got an interest in this, do feel free to write to me about it, or you might want to sort of explore this a little bit on your own. Self-determination theory has been used for all kinds of things, but particularly for looking at engagement and well-being, which are 2 constructs I'm especially interested in. We have 3 fundamental needs that need to be met in order for us to be willing to engage, and in order for us to feel a sense of well-being. And it applies to teachers as well as learners. And I'm going to talk a little bit in a moment about teachers and teacher engagement as well. The 3 levels are, we need to feel a sense of relatedness, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. We need to feel we belong. We need to feel a sense of connection. We need to feel that we are socially in the right environment for us. We need to feel safe, and we need to feel that this is relevant and we're connecting to it. That's about relatedness. Relatedness is not only social, but how we relate to the things that we're doing. We need a sense of autonomy. The idea that what we do matters, that we have some control over what happens to us within the constraints of wherever we find ourselves, and that we can make a difference to the trajectory of our lives, and that applies also to learners and teachers. And competence. We need to feel that we're competent to do what we're being asked to do. We need to feel that we could be able to do that, that we can manage that, that we are able to do that. So these are the sort of 3 background needs that have to be fulfilled in order for a sense of engagement or a sense of well-being to ensue. In the part 1 of the book, we have a whole section talking about context, which I'm not going to address, and we have 3 main sections that we look at. We look at facilitating a learner mindset, getting learners in the right mindset to want to engage. We look at the relationship between teacher and student, which I think is so critically important. And we look at the positive group dynamics and the classroom culture and how we can work on that. And I'm just going to give you, I've got 30 minutes, I'm just going to give you a flavor of the bottom 2, which are the relational aspects of this generating a willingness to engage. So I'm going to focus on the relationship aspect and how we build relationships. One of the reasons why I think CEP were interested in me talking about this aspect of it today is that this is so important also if you're a school leader, or if you're a director of studies, or if you're in any position as a leader. The relationships you create with your staff and among your staff are critical to their engagement and their well-being in the workplace. And so that's why I hope, that some of the things I'll talk about today are relevant not only for teachers and learners, but they're also relevant for school directors and principals and their staff, fundamentally. And I'll give you some examples as we go through. So there's a huge body of research, and it says here, I've just given you 1 quote to support that, so you know I'm not just making this up. An extensive body of research which suggests that the relationships between teachers and students, but also among their peers, are vitally important to all kinds of key educational outcomes, including, of course, engagement. I'm going to give you a quote and have a bit of a guess that maybe, or at least I hope, perhaps resonates with some of your positive memories. One of my favorite quotes. And people will forget what you said, they'll forget what you did, but they will never forget how you made them feel. And I'm fairly unapologetic about the fact that I remain deeply convinced of the importance of the human dimension to language teaching. I am very unapologetic about that. It remains for me vitally important. Without that human connection, everything else is doomed to be a battle. This is the chapters in a nutshell. So we have, at the end of each chapter, we have them in a nutshell, what some of the essence of it is. And in the chapter, we've divided it into some of the guiding principles and some of the key ideas, and we've then got action points of things that you can do. So this is the sort of chapter in a nutshell. In order to develop learner engagement, we need to work on positive relationships with our students and reflect on how we make ourselves available and how we interact with them. Now, just to let me show you, if you just change 2 words. There is no massive difference between the needs of learners and their teachers and between teachers and their directors. There isn't a huge difference here. And the research on teacher engagement points to many of the same things. And teachers need to have a good set of workplace relationships. So even though I'm talking about learners, I do think that many of the things that I'm going to talk about are equally relevant for the workplace. These relationship qualities are what all humans look for. And it doesn't matter who you are, and it doesn't matter what level you're at, it doesn't matter where you are. We all want to have these dimensions to the relationships that we engage with, whatever kind of relationships those are. So there's 3 key concepts in relation to rapport. I'm just cherry picking to just give you a flavor of some of the issues. And I've chosen to focus on 3 things: pedagogical caring, empathy, and effective communication. And I'm just going to highlight just some ideas. It's only a quick snapshot, but just to give you a flavor of some of the things that we can be looking at and thinking about. So let me explain what pedagogical caring is. Pedagogical caring is not just about the fact that the teacher cares for me as a person. It's the fact that they care for my learning. My learning and my progress matters to them. And that's quite important to understand. So sometimes this whole notion of teachers as caring for their learners gets sort of this image of, very sort of carey sharing, put your hand around your shoulder. This is actually quite serious in terms of their learning. They want to know that their learning matters to you, that you take it seriously, that you're invested in their learning. And you communicate that in all kinds of ways. Have you taken time to prepare worksheets? Have you marked their homework and given them feedback? Have you engaged in those micro conversations where you just have a quick chat? They're all ways that we communicate to our learners that not only do they matter to me as a person, but their learning matters to me. I want them to learn. I want them to make progress. And I've just put down here for pedagogical caring, this is also relevant in the workplace. Do the members of staff in your institution feel that they matter to the management, that their professional well-being is important to them? I will leave it open-ended for you to reflect on. Empathy for me, if I could teach everybody on this planet one competence, I would teach them empathy. I think this is so important. And it's something that you continually develop and you continually get better at. It's about trying to see the world through somebody else's eyes. It's imagining how they feel and their perspectives on things. It's not about agreement. You don't have to agree with them. It's about the fact you're trying to imagine how they feel, imagine what it's like to be them, imagine what they're going through, what they're experiencing at that moment in time. And then using that to act compassionately. That's the sort of fundamental next step. And I think with a lot more empathy, a lot of problems would be easier to address. It doesn't mean that you have agreement, I have to stress. It doesn't mean that you're all on the same page, that you're all being in the same perspective. It means that you take the trouble to imagine where they're coming from and try to meet them in an understanding position. If you want to practice your own empathy, this is a great thing to do, and it's kind of fun. It's a little bit like people watching, but with an educational level. Apparently, if we try to read people's faces and name the emotion we think they're experiencing, even if we just name it in our heads and don't say it out loud, we get better at empathy. Our empathy improves. So the idea is that if you go and sit in a coffee shop or you're sat at the airport and just look at people on other tables and look at their faces and try to imagine what emotion are they experiencing right now and try and name it. The naming it's important. Doing that regularly actually helps to increase our empathy. Great activity to give your students for homework. Effective communication, and this is where we come to the notion of listening. There are various strategies. Learning names is fundamental and learning how to pronounce names properly. I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but it's something that perhaps we lose sight of in the hustle and bustle and rush of daily life. Being named is so important. When someone comes up to me and says, "Hi, Sarah, how you doing?" it has quite a different effect on me if they just say, "Hi, how you doing?" The fact they've used my name is very personal, and it strengthens that connection. Knowing little bits of personal detail, I went to observe a teacher in school. She's a brilliant teacher, and I was going to try and understand what makes her so brilliant. The students love her. She's a fantastic teacher. I was amazed at how in every lesson she would find some way of saying, "Oh, by the way, I know that your football team did really well at the weekend. You must be very pleased." And then she would do some other activity, and she'd say, "Now, isn't that related to what you do in gymnastics?" And I just couldn't believe how she knew little details about all her learners, and she could drop them into the lesson very casually. And talk about feeling connected in the classroom. Now, there's all kinds of strategies you can do for this, but without being quite careful about this, but you can make a note and say, "I'm going to make some nice comment to these 3 learners this week." And then next week you move on to another 3 learners, that you consciously try and make that effort to make that connection, to make that sort of interpersonal link. Becoming sensitive to nonverbal communication, the activity I suggested before helps with that. Being yourself, there is a degree of, you have to be authentic in your interactions. Learners feel it very much when you're acting a role. You have to be who you are, and you have to do it in the way that you do it, which is appropriate to you. Self-disclosure, and I've put appropriate here. They don't want to know all details of your life. But when you share something personal with somebody, it's a sign of trust. And sharing some little detail, something about maybe what you did at the weekend, "Oh, I like to do that too." Little things. It doesn't mean you have to reveal your whole life story. But little bits of self-disclosure, as appropriate in your setting, can be a way of building up trust in a relationship. This is a great book called Better Conversations by Jim Knight. And he says, "See students as conversation partners and not as an audience." And I love thinking about that. I think that's a great statement. When I really take that in mind, what I do in the class, I think there's a lot I can learn from that. And be fully present and really listen when they talk. Really listen to what they're telling you, how they're telling you, and how that you respond to that. And I love this one from The Art of People. Be interested instead of interesting. I think that's great advice. It's probably advice I could take on board, but it's good advice. If I was going to give you any advice for better conversation and better communication skills, it would be your advice. Listen more and talk less. You've probably heard the expression, "We have 2 ears and 1 mouth." We should listen twice as much as we speak. So those are the 3 key concepts that we address and we pull out when we're talking about rapport: pedagogical caring, empathy, and effective communication strategies, amongst others. So let's now have a look at the classroom culture and some of the features of that. I'll just let you read in a nutshell our chapter summary. And I'm just going to let you read the version that I have slightly modified to reflect on for teachers and for institutional heads. It's not a stretch to see how these things apply on the level of teachers as well as they do on the level of learners. So 3 key concepts that I've drawn out of, again, a selection, but I chose these 3 for today: psychological safety, group cohesiveness, and democratic participation. So psychological safety is a fabulous construct that has been researched increasingly by Amy Edmondson. So she started, and the first paper she wrote on this was in 1999, and she's been building up a huge body of research on this, which is very compelling. This year, she's brought out a book on it called The Fearless Organization. And if you're interested in the notion of psychological safety, also on an institutional as well as a classroom level, I strongly suggest you read it. It's a fantastic book. Psychological safety is the idea that everybody can participate, everybody can speak up, nobody need be embarrassed, no fear of making mistakes, and nobody will be made fun of, whatever their contribution, and everybody's contribution is safe. Why would you imagine that when psychological safety is high in a hospital, this is the research, why would you imagine when psychological safety is high, the number of reported mistakes rockets? Why? Why have we got more mistakes when we've got psychological safety?
They
They're not afraid to report them. So when they increase psychological safety, and this is kind of slightly alarming, in a hospital, the number of reported mistakes happening increases dramatically because there are opportunities for learning, and the consequences, it's not something to be afraid of. It's not something that's going to have negative effects. So psychological safety strikes me as very important for learners in the classroom, particularly in the language classroom, and also then for educators. I'm just going to let you read some of the items from a psychological safety survey to give you an idea, a flavor of what psychological safety is. Obviously, it goes without saying some of these would be reverse scored, in case you're wondering. I think teachers are very familiar with this, that language teachers particularly are very sensitive to this notion already. They know that this is something that needs to be paid attention to, because learners will not speak up, will not try out new language, will not be brave if they feel at any kind of risk. And the risk is usually, so the research on learner anxiety, speaking anxiety, is that they're not afraid of their teacher. They're afraid of their peers, being made fun of by their peers. So the research on learner anxiety suggests that the anxiety they experience is not because they're afraid the teacher is going to think bad of them, but that they're going to make a fool of themselves in front of their peers. And then you see how important the peer relationships are in the classroom and working on the quality of the culture that we create in the classroom. Group cohesiveness. Group cohesiveness refers then to the quality and the strength of the relationships between learners themselves and to the notion of the group. So how learners relate to each other and how they relate to the group as a whole. A strongly cohesive group is they have good relationships within each other within the group, but also they have a sense of unity, a sense of us, a sense of we about this group. A really interesting study that looked at a meta-analysis, so it's got 17,000 early adolescents, that 33%, now that, if you're aware of achievement studies, that's a massive amount. 33% of the student achievement was explained by peer relationships, the relationships that they had with their peers in their class. And their advice was unequivocal. If teachers want to increase early adolescence achievement, they should facilitate the development of friendships in the classroom. And one of the things we just talked about, for example, is how important it is to make sure that we know learner names. Well, it's even more important to make sure they know each other's names, that they know stuff about themselves. So sometimes we may view these idea of icebreaker activities and these getting to know you and forming these, understanding each other, finding out about each other, that they're seen as kind of extra. For me, they are the foundation, and they are well worth spending time on. If you can develop that security in your group, if you can develop friendships, they're not all going to like each other. That's normal. I don't like everybody in my workplace. They don't like me, probably. But that's part of life. Some people you get on with more than some people. But you have respect and you work together in a mutual trust. One of the things I have the pleasure of doing is I go with a group of students who are sports students and a group of students who are language, and they're both training to be teachers. Some are training to be sports teachers, and some are training to be language teachers. And one of the things that me and the other course director notice is, as soon as we go away for this, we go up to a mountain high in Austria, it's lovely. But one of the things that we notice as soon as we get there is the sports students form teams instantly. If we give them a task to do, an activity to do, it just happens instantly. And the language learners take a lot more time and a lot more coaxing to form into a team. And it's really interesting. You see it very starkly in the context that I'm in. So let me dash on a little bit to the final thing, the notion of democratic participation. This is about things to do with enhancing learner autonomy and responsibility, the teacher being a facilitator. Many of the notions that I think will be familiar with many of you from things like autonomy, learner-centeredness, and so on. I think the big caveat is you have to start where the learners are. It doesn't have to be a massive shift to full-blown democratic participation. You start where the learner is and you do what's appropriate for your group, and you can do it step by step. But the notion is to build in choice and voice. Where do learners, and this applies to staff, Where do they have choice? Where can they make decisions? Where is their voice heard? How do we facilitate hearing what learners have to tell us? In terms of the learners, there are two main areas that we can look at in terms of offering choice and voice. It's the how that they learn, the ways in which they learn, and the what that we learn. Very often the what we learn is constrained by curricula. But sometimes there's a degree of choice in that, and we have a degree of option in that. But certainly in the how we approach learning, we have a lot more choice. Very simple things. You can say to your learners, you know what, guys, we've got this activity to do. This is what needs doing. How long do you think we need? Are we going to need 10 minutes or 15 minutes? What do you think? 10 minutes, put your hand up, 15 minutes. Okay, we'll go for 15 minutes. It's really small. It's about opening that dialogue, seeing your students as partners in the conversation, not as an audience. And you begin with small steps. You start where the learner is, you start with what they are capable of, what they feel comfortable with, and you build up. If you look at some of the most engaging approaches in education, so the research is very clear, these are considered strongly engaging approaches for teaching. Task-based learning, problem-based learning, project-based learning, inquiry-based learning. What do they all have in common? And the things that we have pulled out in the book is something that we call CLARA. I got carried away with acronyms, I apologize. CLARA stands for, they are challenging. We've got this idea that challenging is a bad thing. It's a great thing, but it's the right amount of challenge. Too easy, they'll be bored. Too difficult, also bored. So it's finding that optimum level of challenge. Learner-centered, letting them have some choice and voice. Active, not passively like unfortunately you're doing now, but actively involved in their learning, actively doing things. The learners see what they're doing as relevant and valuable to who they are and to their lives beyond the classroom. And they are rich in opportunities for autonomy. So a good starting point to look for democratic participation, and also looking ahead to this notion of task design and engagement and attention, is reflecting on how CLARA our approaches are. It doesn't have to be full-blown task-based, project-based learning, but we can look at these on the task level. Are we including enough challenge? How much autonomy do they have on this particular activity? Even if it's working with a course book activity, you can think about building in these stages and these levels. So for the positive classroom culture, the key notions I just wanted to give you a flavor of: psychological safety, group cohesiveness, and democratic participation. So just looking at the foundations to recap of willingness to engage, there are 3 levels: the facilitative mindset that I didn't talk about today, teacher-student rapport, and positive classroom culture. If we work on these things, not as additional extras, but as the foundation on which we build our teaching design, I think we're in a better place to have engaged learners. There are no guarantees, but the likelihood is a lot higher. There are my references. That's the book as it's going to be. And thank you very much.